Yes, what?
Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alana Seidman, and I am the program coordinator here at the Department of Senior Services. Welcome to a very special program today. This morning, we will hear the incredible and sad story of Mr. Kurt Manasse, a Holocaust survivor who, as a 4-year-old child, was put on a Kindertransport train to escape the Nazis. He and his brother were the only members of his family to survive. And Mr. Manasse, I would like to say thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your story with us. Thank you all very much for coming. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guest speaker, Mr. Kurt Manasse. Thank you.
I think my story is a little bit unusual for a survivor because I was never in any of the death camps. Part of that is because my father, who was, by the way, on the St. Louis, which was refused entry into Cuba, even though they had, I don't know how many of you know the story of the St. Louis, but it was the last German ship, a cruise ship, to leave Germany before basically there was no more opportunities for Jews to leave Germany. So, and he was denied entry into Cuba along with 1,000 other Jews, and they went to Florida and appealed for asylum, and the United States Congress, State Department, and even the President refused to allow them in on pretty much the same premise that is being used today by the Trump administration to block immigrants from Arabic countries. It was Jews then, now it's Arabs and Mexicans and Salvadorans and so on. So this is we're back to where we were 80 years ago with isolationism and hate mongering and America first and all that nonsense that went on in the 30s when Hitler began to take power and demonstrate what he was. Now, I have to tell you that Hitler was elected by the people as a populist, and that was 1932. He was elected vice chancellor to von Hindenburg. Within a year, he had pretty much deposed von Hindenburg, who was not very well, and then in 1933, he took control of the government. And from there on in, it's a downhill for most of us who are the survivors who managed to get out. Okay. Well, I can show you that this is interesting because this is 1933. This is my brother and my mother, and this is my father and my brother and my mother in Baden-Baden, which is one of the spas. But without a pointer, I have to point over there. Anyway, that's my brother Gus, who was born in 1931. So he'd be 2 years old then. And Baden-Baden, we were Orthodox Jews, and my mother's family had ownership of a hotel in Baden-Baden, which was strictly kosher and all of the things that go with, an Orthodox community. And not the kind of Brooklyn Orthodox community, but the modern Orthodox. And the shul was across the street. And on Kristallnacht, my grandfather was marched to Dachau. And he had been in the First World War and had lost a leg, and he had an Iron Cross. Because what's interesting is under the Kaiser, Jews were quite welcome to join the military, to do all the things that, basically we do in this country. Germany was a very liberal place under the Kaiser. And basically my uncle, my oldest uncle on my father's side, volunteered to join the German army, as did 18% of all the eligible Jewish men, the highest percentage of any religious group in the country. So they were loyal to the Kaiser and loyal to Germany. They could own property, they could become lawyers, doctors, professors, work for the government and all that basically, so our lives were very good. I mean, my father owned a shoe factory, and so he was prosperous. My uncle, another one who survived the First World War, owned the family farm where we raised beef cattle for the kosher meat market. And in a way, it was kind of a vertically integrated family business, although that's what we'd call it today, because the hides were used by my father to make shoes, and the meat was sold to the hotel in Baden-Baden. So it was a very nice community, even though they had nothing to do with each other except through my mother and father who were married. Okay, what changed? The Nuremberg racial laws. This is basically a document that takes away citizenship from all Germans, Jews, that denies them the opportunity to work in any government-related activity, throws them out of universities, throws them out of hospitals, and basically throws them out of judgeships. Many of the Jews were lawyers and became judges. And essentially, the professional people were told, you cannot work in any way unless you do it for Jews only. The high schools, gymnasiums in Germany, were basically closed to Jewish children. So that meant that a lot of the Jews in Germany needed to leave Germany to educate their families, and they did around 1935, 36, 37, and it was still possible even in 38, because that's when my uncle left with his family for America. And he was in New York when my father was on the St. Louis, and would have taken care of my father, but basically he wasn't permitted to. So the ship my father was on sailed back to Europe, and my father had, before he went on the ship, put my brother and I on something which the German government and the Austrian government and the Czech government all made possible, which was a kinder transport, which allowed 20,000 Jewish children between the ages of 3 and 15 and a half to leave if they could find a country that would take them. And so my brother and I were put on a train at 3.5 for me, and my brother was about 7.5, and went to Brussels. Oh, this is my grandma, the evil grandma in Talheim, where the family farm was. This is my father. This is a family picture. I'm showing it here. Family picture of my father, my sister, my grandmother with my brother, and that's my last picture that I have of my sister in 1941, because we left in 1939. Now this is the next event, Kristallnacht. This is the night of the broken glass. This is when Hitler basically got his brown shirts to destroy Jewish property, to hurt people who were Jewish. My mother had her teeth kicked in by somebody coming up to the apartment and just basically mauling her. My father was at work, so he worked in a factory, and they didn't bother with factories, but the shop owners were beaten up, and about 70 or 80 people actually were killed in both Vienna and in Frankfurt and other parts of Germany. So this was the warning that my father realized meant you better get the hell out of Germany if you can. And he went as far as he could to get out and then make a place for his family, because my grandmother, who had come to live with us and my uncle left, was basically unwilling to leave Germany. She said, I was born in Germany, I will die in Germany. And so my mother was stuck with my sister, who was too young to get on the train, and her mother-in-law. And so the women basically were in Germany, and the men, my father, came back to Brussels, where we were, and spent a year. And so you'll see pictures of me in Brussels. Well, this is basically a discussion, so which says basically the same thing that I've been telling you here. I'll give you a chance to read that, but basically that is where my father winds up being murdered eventually, as most of the people on that ship were, because they're still in Europe. They weren't allowed to come here. This is my father, and that's me, and that's my brother, and that's the family that my father was able to stay with. My brother and I were in an orphanage, and this is my 4th birthday. And here we are in Brussels on my brother's 8th birthday. So, I mean, we lived normally in Brussels. It was peacetime. It's a prosperous city, about the same size as Frankfurt. So, for me, I didn't have to do anything. My father was there, my brother was there. I missed my mother, but I didn't really know who she was anyway, so it didn't register on me. There was nothing that happened. Now, when on the night of in May 10th, the Germans invaded Brussels, along with, they had taken Holland in about a week, and they took Belgium in 2 days, and basically were bombing the trains that were trying to leave Brussels. And the orphanage that the kinder transport children were in, one for girls, one for boys, managed to find 2 railroad cars, cattle cars, and attach them to the last train to leave for France. France was still not at war with Germany then. Remember, this is 1939. This is not, 1940 now. But basically, the French are not occupied by the Germans at that point. They have been fighting, which if those of you who know the movie Dunkirk realize that after Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, that the French and the English had an agreement to support Poland, sent an expeditionary force, which got beaten badly and wound up trying to escape at Dunkirk. And you all know the story of Dunkirk, but the fact is that France itself had not been invaded at that point. But basically, so it was still secure, and the train was able to land in France. And now Hitler, during that time, moved down to France. And by the time, we were there for a little bit, France, that part of France had been separated from the main part of France, Paris, and all the big cities, and all of the harbors and ports, and which was Germanized with the Gestapo. But in the southern part of France, it was mostly farmland, and therefore they didn't feel they needed to occupy it. They needed food, and they needed basically farmers to be left alone, and so they did. So this is the children that I was along with. These are all kinder transport. They come from basically Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, all of which had kinder transports, one from Prague, one from Vienna, and from Berlin in Germany. And this is me. There's a little girl there, and I'm right next to a little girl looking sideways. And I'm up near the front in this big picture. So this was the smallest children, and Antoinette and I had a crush on each other. She was about 4 also, but she was younger than I. But again, we lived kind of like as a group, but it was like being on a farm. It was a barn that we slept in, but it was doable. This is the chateau that we wound up at after the first year, and it is still there. And I've gone back to visit all these places, and this is inside the chateau. And so this was all very nice. And this is me in the middle, the guy with the little bald head. And this is me and my gang. Now, I have to tell you about the Kindercamp. Antoinette was picked up and came to America by the Quakers. The Quakers wound up bribing basically customs officials, whatever it was that they did, not customs officials, immigration officials, and were able to take in children who had no families. Well, the assumption was all of us had no families, because that's why, basically we were put on a train and they tried to save their own lives. But the fact is that, they basically we were protected because the Swiss Red Cross ran the school, this orphanage, and because it also had Christian children, because the French people who had parents that had been in the war and were interned in camps and things, so they were basically taking care of Christian children as well as Jewish children, and they also bribed the policemen who were French, and the French can be bribed rather easily, but the Gestapo could not be bribed because they would just shoot you and take whatever they wanted anyway. So, but they were able to keep the police from taking us away, even though they knew we were Jewish. They used to do short-arm inspections on the boys, so they could tell. Catholics did not. French is mostly a Catholic country, and they weren't circumcised. But anyway, but the gang protected me because I was being picked on by the older children. I used to pee in bed, and so they had a little sign on my back, "Le Petit Pisseur," and now you all know about the pisseur in Belgium, in Brussels, in the Grand Place. That's a little pisser. It's a fountain that, so I was a copy of the fountain.
Fred, were the children aware what was happening around them in terms
No,
of danger?
we had no news of what was happening. Basically, the French Vichy were in cahoots with the Germans, and therefore they rounded up all the Jews, people, male and female, that they could get their hands on and put them in camps. My father was actually in Brussels, and when he put us on the train, when the Germans captured Brussels within a few hours, all the people who were foreigners, not Belgian, with citizenship, but all the foreigners, including my father, were rounded up by the Belgian police and put in a detention environment, probably some kind of a prison or a hospital or something that had locked gates, and they were kept there until the Germans decided what to do with them. Well, what the Germans decided when they set up Vichy was that there was a number of prisoner camps in France from when the Spanish Civil War was going on. The Germans on the side of Franco and the communists on the side of the monarchy, and they basically set up camps on the French side for people who could escape from Spain. And my father was interned in a place called Camp Gurs, G-U-R-S, in southern France, near the Pyrenees. Well, we were not very far from the Pyrenees either, in the little town that we were in, and so it turned out that I was able to visit my father. So this is the middle-aged children, which my brother was among. the next group. And this is my father, my brother and I, and my Tante Lisa, whose father was my grandfather. She was a sister to my mother, and she was married to the chef at the hotel, who was a French chef who was Jewish, and he cooked kosher, but he was the camp cook. And one of the reasons that I'm a cook and my brother was a cook is you never kill a good cook. And so when my father was not a member of that family, but my grandfather was in that same camp. There's my grandfather and my tante, and that's the daughter, my cousin Evie, who was born in that camp. And again, because my uncle was the cook and his wife got pregnant, she was actually had problems, clamp something or other, and was sent to Paris to take care of her. So the French guards, who loved their food, allowed my uncle and his wife to have a child, and my cousin grew up in that camp for a little bit. So that's what we were able to do, and the International Red Cross arranged this visit. This is a memorial plaque that has been put at the chateau where we stayed, because after the war, the little school that some of the children went to, about 2 kilometers away, has become a museum. And so it's now a museum of the children of l'Île. And if you put down, Chateau de l'Île on your search engine, you will find the museum, you will find the chateau, you will see lots of pictures of children. So we are now, immortalized. Okay, now things are getting tough, and the Germans have been beaten at Stalingrad. The Italian have been thrown the hell out of most of the positions, fighting with the Germans because they're ineffectual. So the Nazis take over in Rome and other places in Italy. We're coming up into the American army has left Africa and is now in Sicily and going up to Naples and all that stuff. So the Germans are retreating on a lot of different fronts. They've lost in Africa, and so they decide they have to take over southern France because they've got to get ready for the invasion of France. They know it's going to come. They don't know where it's going to come or when it's going to come, but they know that they're going to be invaded on the western flank as well. And so basically they take over. Things now get tougher at the orphanage because you can't bribe the Gestapo, and they take the older children away and actually ship them to a transport camp where they're about to go to Auschwitz. The wife of the Swiss man who runs the chateau goes to the camp that the kids are being held in and says, these children are under the protection of the Swiss government and you cannot take them to Auschwitz. And the French commander of the camp is bluffed into believing her. We had no passports. We had no connection to the Swiss government, which was neutral. So basically, she bluffed her way and got the children out. But after that, we all had to start escaping from France. And we knew that the easiest way to get across was through Switzerland. And a lot of the children on Christmas Day and on New Year's Day, when they thought it would be easy, escaped into Switzerland. Once the Nazis took over, you couldn't cross the Swiss border anymore because now it wasn't French people guarding the border on the French side, it was Nazis. And so that left only really one way out, and that was climbing over the Pyrenees. And that's what my brother and I did with a group of about 3 other people. and a guide, a Basque guide. We went over the Pyrenees. This was March of 1944, and it was a harrowing climb. My daughter has just reproduced that climb as part of a thing that I can tell you about, but it was not a trivial climb. It's a 10,000 foot mountain range between Spain and France, but we managed. Now here we are in Barcelona, Spain, and I am in front, and my brother is right behind me, and my brother's in the corner, and we were in a safe house because if Franco's people had found us, they would have deported us back across the border to France into the hands of the Gestapo. So we had to hide, and for 2 months we stayed on top of one of the 7 hills of Spain, which turns out to have been the one that the Olympics were run on. So although we were in Barcelona, my wife and I, we couldn't find the house, although I knew where it was, because we couldn't get on, they wouldn't allow us to go up the top of the mountain. But I remember looking down a long flight of stairs from the top of the mountain all the way to the bottom, and never being able to go more than a few steps before I was told, get back inside, you can't walk down, you can't be seen. Now here are the Jewish children in the orphanage in Lisbon. We managed, after about a couple of months, to sneak over the border in Portugal, and by train, and I'll recount a story afterwards about the train, and I'm the little guy with shading his eyes there, and my brother is in the corner, the last one in the corner, and I'm holding a Portuguese flag. And this is when I left Europe and arrived in America. On Christmas Day, we left Lisbon and came to Philadelphia first because New York was closed. And then I got put on a train in Philadelphia. And that first day in America was another one of these terrifying days for me because, again, I was on a train. Every time we left one of the cities or one of the countries, it was by train. And you never knew what was going to happen on that train. And I'll tell you my favorite train story, which is that I did not realize that I remembered a lot of the details about the train ride crossing the Spanish border into Portugal. I was told, since I didn't know any Portuguese and I didn't know any Spanish, and all I could speak was French, not to open my mouth. And I pretend to be asleep because we basically were trying to avoid being inquired about. The couple that was taking my brother and I were Spanish citizens, had a passport, and they just said, oh, the kids are sleeping, leave them alone. And that was what they did. And apparently we managed to get away with it. But it turns out that for me not to speak for 45 minutes or so is very difficult, as you can tell. I am talkative. And it was very difficult. And when I went back, when I was in my 50s, with my wife, we took a train from France into Brussels to Barcelona. And it was the same thing. I could swear it was the same dogs and the same guards with the guns getting on the train on the Spanish side and looking, and they actually took somebody off the train who was apparently carrying drugs. But I was gripping my seat for 45 minutes while that exchange was going on, didn't say a word. And my wife said, I've never seen you like this afterwards. So I relived the experience even though I didn't even remember it. And when it's very strange what you remember when you wind up in the same place. When I went to Baden-Baden, we were invited by the city at some point to come back for what they called not a reunion, but basically a forgiveness celebration where the town welcomed the Jews back that they had thrown out. Obviously my mother and father were dead, so we went in their place. And when I went there, they took us all around, including to our hotel, which had been bought by the city and converted to the Hall of Records. Well, I didn't recognize anything. I mean, it was a hotel. Now it's just a room filled with documents, and I recognized nothing. And then I said to the mayor, "Is there a basement here?" And the mayor of the town said, "I don't know. We've never inquired." I said, "Well, can we find out?" And he sent somebody back to the city hall, and sure enough, there was a basement. They had a key, and the guy came back with the key, and we went down in the basement. And the first thing I do is I look at the floor, and I said, "I know this floor." It was gray and blue, and I remembered as a 2-year-old or 3-year-old kid, what do you see? You see the floor, and you look up your mother's skirt, who's at the counter, cooking or cutting up vegetables or whatever, because the kitchen was in the basement. And then I look in the corner, and I see a white door, and I said, "Is that a dumbwaiter?" Mayor said, "I don't know." So I open it, and it's a dumbwaiter. And I remember it because my brother used to haul me up with the food to the rooms. So at 2 years old, or 3, which is the last time I could have possibly been in Baden-Baden, I had a memory. But I had to be there to get the memory. So, there are a number of other instances where I just, remembered things because I was in the place. So, I basically do not know, I did not have a hard time during the war, which is, kind of good for me, but I don't feel as though I was victimized very much. Now, this is a short form of my life in the USA because you're not interested in what I consider my success, which was to come to a country where I didn't have to do what my father said, because my father had been taken to Auschwitz in 1942 and exterminated from that camp that I saw him last in. My mother had been taken to a camp in Czechoslovakia when she tried to cross and got caught, along with my sister. And although I know where my father died, and I made a sculpture which is in their museum permanently and donated it to them, I went to Theresen, where my mother and sister were in 1944. That was the model camp that they showed the Swiss International Red Cross. But after they left, everyone was deported to Poland and to the death camps. So my mother I was an orphan when I was 9 years old, but I didn't even know it until I was in my 40s when I was able to find out what had happened, at least to my father. We still don't really know where my mother and sister died, but we know that they did die because everybody did that was in that camp. Now, you want to know why it took me so long to realize that I was a survivor, because even the survivors didn't want us to be considered survivors because we hadn't been in the camps. So they were just as selective about who they accepted as survivors in their organizations. And we were just children, and they said, "Oh, you didn't suffer." Well, I lost my family, I lost my education, I lost my language, but I didn't suffer, right? I mean, you don't suffer from that. So they basically called us immigrants, but they'd said we were not survivors. We didn't survive anything like they did. And it took me a long time to realize, and it took until 1990, when I went to a meeting in New York organized by the B'nai B'rith, who adopted hidden children, which is what we were, and child survivors as members, full-fledged member of the community. And since we're mostly the ones who are speaking out, we're the ones that, actually making people aware of the fact that this country is beginning to go into the same directions as happened then. I was an engineer, as you saw, and a professor, and had my own business and solar energy and stuff. But when I retired, I decided I didn't want to do anything practical. I always loved art. I've never had a chance to study it, but I decided I would study how to do art. And I went to Framingham State, which at that time, when I was 67, let anyone over 65 take all the classes he could audit. And I took every studio class, drawing, painting, sculpture, ceramics, and fell in love with sculpture. So I decided, well, I got to go to graduate school now. And so I went to Harvard. From Framingham, you go to Harvard. And at Harvard, I was doing ceramics. Then I came across the street to your art museum, well, your new art center, and I took classes in sculpture. And I got to be pretty good. It's basically a master class. And I made nudes, and I made, and after my son died, I made heads. And I decided it's time. And this is 2009, and I make my first memorial sculpture. And this is about my family. This is the piece. And I call this My Diaspora. It's won many prizes, including one from the Newton Art Association, of which I'm a member. And it features my last sculpture of my sister on her birthday at the bottom. And it's sort of an upside-down family tree. My father on the left, my mother and sister on the right, where they died with a little Jewish star. My brother on the left and me on the right when we come to America. And the hands are reaching out, and that's a euonymus bush branch, which, if you know the euonymus, looks like barbed wire. It's also the burning bush of Moses, so it has both religious implications, and you can look at it that way. And then, of course, it also has the barbed wire, which separated me from my family. It is the most difficult piece of sculpture I ever attempted. And I had to make each piece by itself and then weld them together. It was an ordeal. It was very expensive to make, but it is probably, and the person who evaluated me when I was doing this said, this will be the best piece of sculpture you'll ever build in your life. This is a blow-up of it. This is a memorial I made in memory of the 6 million Jews, which features hands. At the museum in Auschwitz, where other people have sculpture as well that they've donated, as I did, there's a lot of Jewish stars and a lot of hands. A lot of other people who make sculpture apparently use those as pieces to remember the more dead ones. This is in memoriam, another sculpture I made. Again, the hands holding a cup, basically a Yortzeit candle, for those of you who know. And we light it once a year in memory of those who died. This is a piece that I brought to Auschwitz, and it is sitting in Auschwitz in the museum now, and it is remembering them, which is, at that point I wasn't sure whether my sister and my mother had died at Auschwitz, so I just made a piece. But again, hands and a Jewish star. This is another version, and this is something for my sister and the 1.5 million children who were murdered in the Holocaust. And the piece was desecrated. Can somebody just pick that up? It's heavy. It's bronze. And a year and a half later, it was recovered. The piece rotates. Again, a candle goes in here, a memorial candle, and it sits in the cemetery, or it sat in the cemetery in Milton, and I had entered it into a competition and won. And after the competition was over, I decided they wanted to keep it, and I said, well, it's cost me several $1,000s to make, and they said, well, we can't afford to buy it. So I said, I'll tell you what, this is a wonderful place for me to remember my sister, because I have no idea where her grave is or her ashes are, therefore I will donate it to the cemetery. And it sat there for a couple of years, and then somebody broke it off. There was a big piece here that anchored it to a piece of marble, which I also carved, by the way. And so now it's on its way up to Maine, to the foundry, and we're going to see if we can figure out how to fix it so it stays in place, and we'll probably have to put a surveillance system in. But I thought you would like to see that it was recovered from somebody in New Hampshire. What apparently happened is, as opposed to a hate crime, which is what we thought it was at that time, because we had no idea, it turns out that some kid who is known, to be a vandal, thought his friend in New Hampshire would like it. He liked it, so he said, well, I'll steal it from my friend. And he was able to break off the piece from this is at the cemetery next to a little pond, and it's, it's a nice resting place for my sister. And I got the idea of doing that because once a year, on the Sunday between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we gather at Brandeis at a sculpture of Job, which has underneath it the ashes from all the death camps. And so we the survivor community, and the students at Brandeis go to a service that we do there, Yisko it's called, and we memorialize or remember our family members that we don't have anymore. Well, I thank you for your attention.